Hey guys, I haven't done a video like this in a while, but a lot has happened in the last year. We've done a full season and a half of Outlands, so it's time to do some catching up. For some reason, YouTube tends to push these types of videos to random people outside of my community, so if that happens to be you, cool. Probably just click off if this ain't your thing. But if you're curious to hear about a story from an emergent D&D style world that generates EVE Online-esque adventures, stories, and politics, with just a little bit of role-playing added in, well, maybe you'll find it interesting regardless. If this is something you really find interesting, be sure to check out the pinned video on the channel. It's an explanation on what exactly the Outlands experience is, the rules that govern it, the universe, and, well, how to join. Alright, that's enough blue balling, let's get to it. The entirety of Season 4 Outlands can be summarized by single man cons the entirety of several hundred-person community to do his biddings. That would be a big deal if he was on equal footing with everyone else, but yeah, on top of that, that also happened to be the biggest faction, kind of stacking the entire game into his favor if it wasn't for certain circumstance. This person was Admiral Tragan, or that's his in-game name, and was part of what we like to call the First Fleet, or simply referred to as the First. This whole series of events is even more impressive when you consider, going into the start of this year, this faction was ultimately positioned to actually be kind of a bad guy that everyone was about to gang up on, with a number of failed Gulf of Tolkien-esque incidents, as his predecessor was trying to get other factions to all fight among themselves. Things were going so poorly, in fact, that a section of this faction broke off and ultimately formed a separate faction, Task Force Dawn, or TFD. So how did this man pull it off? Well, that's the video, and fortunately he was willing to share with me his, 27,000 part plan. The first step was ultimately that aforementioned Task Force Dawn, TFD, and returning them back into the fold. Having a huge former part of your faction bordering 90% of your territory not being a fan of you was not a great starting point, and that's what he tackled first. Now, reunification was probably not going to happen, but he could do a lot to repair relations. This was done with the classic carrot and stick. First Fleet increasingly, both overtly and through intentional fake leaking, built up an understanding that they were mobilizing to attack TFD in the imminent future. Despite the split, this was not going to be a pretty war for TFD, and TFD was stressing big time about it. First Fleet outnumbered them by over 4-1, and production-wise almost triple that. If TFD would not be able to sink more than a light cruiser per turn, First Fleet would actually end up getting a net ship gain over the course of the war, which is a tall order. Internally, TFD was sweating balls about this war and was scrambling for allies as things have moved a lot faster than they thought. Combined with the carrot, First Fleet was offering TFD peer responsibilities in a joint alliance called UCIS, United Coalition of Inner Systems. People tend to also call it UKIS, but those people are also wrong. Anyway, this combination of a carrot and stick ended up working to disguise what was ultimately a bluff. First Fleet was not at all configuring for war at this stage, especially since engaging TFD outright would likely turn the entire system against them, as TFD had some soft and hard allies. However, what ultimately would convince TFD to switch sides and to really solidify this alliance was the warship EFN Eternity's advent. This was a large, essentially super battleship for the scale that the system was taking part in, and it was looking for passage into the inner system, the location where the First Fleet and TFD was located at. Under normal circumstances, TFD would almost certainly have allowed this. EFN and TFD have a very robust relationship, with a core TFD member being long-standing friends with the Eternity, and EFN actively helping TFD with an ongoing food crisis on their planet of Safina, caused by the splintering and loss of the two other food centers, Pisces and Typhon. First Fleet, however, heavily pushed their diplomatic might here, framing the Eternity's demands to enter the inner system as a breach of sovereignty and overall militaristic in nature, which is, not entirely incorrect, but it further served to push TFD into an inner system first mindset. While the situation would eventually resolve without the ship ever entering the system, these events in a few short weeks pushed TFD from being on the verge of war against First Fleet to distinctly being in the middle or even in a pro-First Fleet position. The story of manipulation continues, for reasons I'm not going to get into because it's literally the entire plot of the finale of Season 4. First Fleet was very interested in getting the Outer Reach to fight itself in preparation for a overall general invasion. Basically, have them soften themselves for the invasion. This is obviously easier said than done. The Outer Reach is very wary after a botched war with itself that literally resulted in no gains at all. Well, actually, honestly, it resulted in negative gains. The once mighty Rider faction was now reduced to 2 tiles, so our boy Tragan had his work cut out for him. He started by weakening the TFD-CPR bond. TFD, I've already mentioned, and CPR, well, a core faction of the Outer Reach. And Tragan went to work on dismantling this. TFD and CPR were allies during the previous war, however, right now a small point of contention was the planet of Safina. Narratively, Safina had a lot of CPR civilians on it after the CPR faction was squeezed during the previous war. However, the planet itself belonged to TFD. This was a working problem that both factions were willing to address and could reasonably responsibly manage. Right up until our bro Tragan stuck his inner hand into it. CPR was a proud group, probably the proudest group, so to speak, in this little universe, and they ultimately expected that at some point, some portions or the entirety of Safina would be returned to them. First Fleet knew this to be the case and acted as proxy during negotiation. This was a great idea, proxies are always nice, except First Fleet had no intention of actually solving this and resulting in a functional deal between CPR and TFD. Like the devil on your shoulder, First Fleet told TFD what TFD wanted to hear, while playing up CPR's demands as being worse than they were, and to CPR playing up TFD's complete unwillingness to compromise to the extreme. The end result was that within about a month of real time, TFD and CPR, who were former allies, were now at each other's throats. Too angry to even bother tracing down any amounts of truth amid a web of half-truths and lies. CPR, especially at this point, had convinced themselves that Safina was there and no compromise was possible due to First Fleet meddling. Similarly, TFD was of the opposite mindset and decided to expel the CPR consulate from Safina and barred their involvement on the planet going into the future. To say that CPR did not take this well is a major understatement, and much to the surprise of everyone involved, Tragan included, CPR essentially backed itself in a corner and then stabbed itself repeatedly. First by calling the TFD bluff, which was not really a bluff, and then sending an unmarked Black Ops team to protect the CPR embassy on Safina with very loose ROE restrictions. One shootout later, the CPR embassy was secured by TFD, but not before CPR had killed off a number of TFD personnel, among which a very beloved TFD admiral. And with that, Tragan's wildest dreams were fulfilled. Not only was the TFD-CPR relationship shattered, but both were actively clamoring for war. One more aspect. In the Outer Reach, there was a minor conflict brewing. The Riders had splintered into 2 factions, the Riders and the Free Riders, and as a result, basically wanted to still kill each other. In game, of course, though, if you put them together in a room in real life, I can't make any promises that some people wouldn't walk out of there with manslaughter charges. Anyway, the Khans, their neighbor to the west, and the Free Riders, the splinter faction I mentioned, distrusted the Riders majorly, and the Riders, with very good reasons, also distrusted them. The Riders, however, once as the largest faction with the currently largest cruiser force in the system, was clamoring to be much more than a 2-tile faction, and the CPR territory to the, air quotes, east, and their foe in the last war seemed the perfect place to get it. So with some backdoor maneuvering, First Fleet offered the Riders a place in this war to expedite the process of curb-stomping Pioneers-only democracy. Remember, First Fleet goal was infighting, and they would soon get it. When both TFD and the Rider Navy attacked CPR, CPR was understandably crushed in relatively short order. And that's where the maneuvering came in. UCIS was not actually currently in a position to deal with a Rider faction owning CPR space. That would actually probably create more strength in the Outer Reach, not less. So after the first set of battles, CPR was offered an olive branch, yield to the UCIS, and give tribute basically in the form of half their navy and submit to their wills, and they would be spared destruction. This, of course, was accepted, and UCIS now had a buffer state, was significantly larger, while basically taking CPR out of the picture, all the while denying Riders the territory gain without fear of reprisal. On top of this, the added benefit was all the other factions in the Outer Reach now viewed that the Riders were still very much of a conquest-type mindset, which played directly to their fears. For the Khans and Free Riders especially, who would go on to form a joint alliance, they now viewed the Riders as the biggest threat to the system, not the inter-system faction. And so, discontent was sown, and the Khans and Free Riders would eventually strike across the border and engage the Rider Navy. And UCIS, well, honestly, just TFD would also partake in this fight, basically pinning the Riders into the corner of the map, essentially ensuring their destruction. At this point, you'll notice TFD is doing a lot of the legwork in these wars instead of the First Fleet, despite First Fleet being larger and more well-trained in a lot of ways. This would become especially apparent in this war against the Riders, while stretched against the brink against 4 factions, 2 of which represented 50% of the power value of this entire board state. The Riders were actually able to hold their own in the short term, sinking a number of critical TFD capital ships, including the TFD battleship Bastille, in an astounding display of battlefield prowess. Meanwhile, not a single First Fleet formation had been seriously engaged at combat at this point. Everything was going as planned. However, a couple of wrenches were thrown into the mix. The UCIS was preaching a message of simply intervening where needed and playing up to the fears of both TFD, CPR, cons, riders, etc. to do whatever war they needed to do at the time. Always framing a war in a way that appeased the outer reach factions, allowing First Fleet to slowly carve its way through the system and falling right into the hands of infighting. However, 2 factions saw through this strategy, Phoenix and the Eternity's Advent, and thus plans were made to fight sooner rather than later to prevent this line of conquest. Phoenix was actually an up-and-coming faction, having made out quite well in the previous war, and while small, had a couple of core formations that up until this point were basically undefeated, even able to go up against super capital formations. But things were moving so fast, Phoenix needed a couple of turns to mobilize for an all-out war and first strike, as well as to get the battleship out of their shipyard, which was finishing up presently. Eternity was going to buy them that time, as well as work behind the scenes to prevent a number of scenarios from unfolding, and this is where Tragan kind of blundered. Eternity also had to go balls deep into the inner system because their captain was there for reasons. Go watch the seasons if you want details on that mess. Right as the Riders were being attacked and the CPR offensive has been wound down, the crew of Eternity did roughly 4 things. They assembled a heavy ECM Phoenix stealth formation to jam the Eternity presence as it pushed into the inner system. Now, while the UCIS can't see jammed ships because, well, they're jammed, the functional equivalent of a void of space moving through their territory was incredibly obvious, and they would obviously respond in kind to meet this force. EFN, of course, knew this and attempted some heavy misdirection. EFN contacted CPR, who was now part of the UCIS, with a key message. Hey, we will come and save you. We are attacking down through Remington, and then we're going to push to relieve you. We need you to rise up against your UCIS menace when we come. The Riders will be making a similar push from their side. CPR responded with, I don't think we can do that, but don't worry, your secret is safe with us. And then instantly leaked this message to their new UCIS allies. This was actually entirely expected. The actual purpose of this message was for the CPR to leak it, intentionally. The seed was now planted in the UCIS from one of their allies that a relief force was going to attack on the lower front. This also served on the EFN side of things to dispel any doubts between EFN and Phoenix that CPR was worth saving. They were now firmly planted as an enemy. The third objective here was drive to secret home, to guarantee that UCIS bought the lie. EFN happened to be privy that VPC, a sub-UCIS faction, was selling classified information about the routes through the belt to anyone willing to pay the price that wasn't directly an enemy of UCIS. Through an intentional third-party leak, EFN leaked this message to UCIS with a little bit of subtle suggestions to point out that this information was being leaked expressly for the purpose towards EFN to get them to push through that aforementioned corridor to free up CPR. Now, with 2 independent leaks that both said the same thing, UCIS bought this lie, and thus diverted a huge amount of ECM and actual forces to the Safina region to stop this incursion and attack on CPR space. Except that was never the plan. Eternity, with her stealth formation, wanted to go deep into UCIS space, and was able to ultimately meet up with Triple C to form an effective raiding party. Similarly, Phoenix was not interested in pushing down here at first, and was simply attacking across the belt against a number of capital ship formations. And thus a huge amount of heavy assets were prevented from being put into play for about half of this war. Finally, EFN, while somewhat disregarded in this war, still had some sway in the system, and while they weren't able to get Khans and the Free Riders to join their war against the First Fleet, they were at least able to cause these guys to cease operation against the Riders, thus freeing up the Riders to fight the UCIS alone and then eventually alongside the Phoenix Coalition. And this gets us to the final act of this first half of the war. With this misdirection, Phoenix and the Riders were able to move and destroy CPR with a couple key wins, freeing up the Riders and restoring their former borders and allowing Phoenix to focus on their own defense against UCIS. Looking at the overall map, it's quite clear. While this season was marked by Rider and Phoenix victories, the map still distinctly paints a harsh truth. The most hated faction in the system was able to result in the death of one major faction while also pouring half their navy onto the Phoenix doorstep with virtually zero losses on their hands. All the while, one of the major factions, which swore an oath to fight the First Fleet, is standing idly by. How they pulled it off? Well, now you know the story. Hey, if this is something that interests you, we're always looking for new players. Go check out the pinned video on the channel to see if this is something you may want to partake in. Regardless, thanks for watching. We'll see you later. Bye.